Okay, so my name is Ella Johnson. These are my classmates, Megan and Meg. But we are students at Mount Liberty College. We all just graduated a couple days ago, actually. Mount Liberty College is a unique type of school because it's so small. The student body is quite small. It started a couple years ago, so it's still pretty new as well. And it's a huge focus on the classical works and a true education instead of job training. Right now we're in Provo, Utah. So Mount Liberty College used to be in Murray, but we just moved also a couple days ago. So that's exciting. So this is our Provo campus now. So that's a little bit about Mount Liberty, but you'll get to know more about it as we discuss. We're doing a little mock discussion of what maybe a class would look like at Mount Liberty, or even just a lunch chat with students, because we can't stop discussing all the things we're learning. We love it so much. So today we're going to discuss A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell.
This is one of the great books that we read at Mount Liberty College, A Conflict of Visions, and it just has so many great principles and a lot of just ideas that we could discuss in a lot of the classes at Mount Liberty College. The idea behind this book specifically is that Thomas Sowell is pointing out patterns in history, and these patterns come from these two competing ideas and these two different worldviews. And so he's exploring what those different visions look like, why they conflict, how they conflict, and just the different aspects.
Something really interesting, I think, that he, and kind of a motivation for him to write the book. In the political sphere, it's easy to see kind of what he's demonstrating is that oftentimes when there's kind of these differences of opinions or views or visions, as he would say, that we're talking circles and that we're not actually getting anywhere. In general, there's even more than just a disagreement on facts, I guess, is this idea that there's these opposite visions that are always just circling, going over the same basic problems and never quite seeing eye to eye.
But I wanted to talk a little bit about Thomas Sowell because I think he's the coolest guy ever. He's this black economist, right? Okay, and you guys might have to help me. I'm like pulling from random videos.
Used to be Marxist.
Used to be Marxist, yes.
When you were a Marxist, the notion, explain that, because the Marxism.
Well, but no, you see,
Yeah, so that's complicated.
Even when I was a Marxist, I had the same intellectual standards.
Right.
And that's what eventually led me away from it. And so socialism is a great idea. That does not mean it's a great reality.
And then he was involved in government and realized how much they fudged the facts. And he was like, wait a minute, it's really dumb to be Marxist. So I'm going to be a conservative. So I think most people know Thomas Sowell from his works on economics and stuff, which is why this book is kind of, I feel like most people haven't heard about this book because it's so out there.
So Thomas Sowell in this book brings up that there's two main visions. The two main visions are, on the one end, a constrained vision, and on the other, an unconstrained vision. And to start off with the constrained vision, they have different views about human nature. They feel like it is much more fallible and imperfect, and that people are kind of going to consistently stay the same in this kind of fallible place with human nature, that it's society and kind of traditions that help kind of offset these kind of negative aspects sometimes in our human nature. Whereas there's the unconstrained vision, which leads with beliefs like perfection, and that throughout time with the reason and from humans that we can create something better, rise above these maybe negative aspects of human nature, and that we can change and become better through progression, and as a group, I guess, with as a society together we can progress.
What's so cool about this book too is once you read it, you see it in all the classes everywhere, including Hunger Games, which we don't read in any of our classes. But I read it, and so Suzanne Collins' second most recent novel, called The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, she quotes 5 philosophers in the beginning of her book. But I think they all all those philosophers, particularly 3 of them, represent the vision super well. And so she quotes Rousseau, and Rousseau is pretty like Thomas Sowell says no one's 100% one vision or the other, but Rousseau is pretty close to 100% unconstrained, because she quotes him when he says, men are born free yet everywhere in chains, which is this idea that like men are perfect, and if they just went back to their state without society, they would be unstoppable, like we'd be awesome. But it's society that kind of drags us down. So it's like through re-education that people can reach this full potential. And then she quotes Hobbes, who has this crazy view of human nature that's very negative, where he says like men are nasty and brutish and short and what was the other thing he said?
Like that's a man's life.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah,
horrible.
just a horrible nature, and that their natural state is war. So they're just like Lord of the Flies. If you're put on an island with people, you're going to kill people, which is the Hunger Games, which is why it's so cool that she uses these quotes and this philosophy in her books, because that's the idea of the Hunger Games, that they fight to the death to remind them of their awful natures. So then she quotes Locke, John Locke, when she talks about reason and kind of like navigating our natures through reason. But I think those three philosophers represent the visions really well, where Rousseau is really unconstrained and Hobbes is really constrained, because we need like laws or government or society, traditions. Thomas Sowell doesn't really talk about laws. He usually talks about the unconstrained needing laws to re-educate people, and he talks more about the constrained needing traditions and values. But for Hobbes, he used government. He wanted government to control people's natures.
While we're reading this book in the class, there's some parts where like, this is unconstrained. Like, how am I able to kind of justify these seemingly conflicting beliefs within the constrained and unconstrained when I seem to be living both? And I think we both agree. Meg, I don't know if you agree, but I see in my religious views a lot more unconstrained principles of like this human nature that has potential to change. Where in constraint, it's like, no, that's never going to happen. But I like what you said, Meg, when you said, when you're kind of describing unconstrained as its progression as a society. And I see that as kind of a big difference. And that kind of helped me understand it a little better, I think, where in my religious views, this is progression individually. Like, as an individual, I can choose, but on the whole, I can still kind of have this philosophy of, power corrupts, human nature is flawed, people tend to do bad things if it's easier than doing good things.
Yeah, I want to read that part because it's my favorite part of the whole book. But he says, no, this is like on my page 103. No theory is literally 100% constrained or 100% unconstrained. To be totally unconstrained in the most literal sense would be to have omniscience and omnipotence. And then later he says, 100% constrained vision would mean that man's every thought and action are predestined. So it makes sense that you couldn't be 100% one or the other, because unconstrained, you are God basically, because you're like, we are progressing eternally, we know everything, we're immortal. And then constrained would be, we're so deeply flawed that like we can predict everything everyone does, because human nature is so predictable. But yeah, I love that part. That's great.
No, and I think it's really interesting. It kind of goes back to the title of the book, where it says it's a conflict between these visions. And we've kind of, been discussing this a little bit, but they are so different that there is a conflict between the two. And like we've been talking, this navigating kind of when we feel like we are embracing, aspects of a vision we don't normally associate with ourselves. But I think it's interesting because this conflict goes beyond simply they have different views of the world. It goes down to even definitionally. They have different understandings of what different things are. And I think it's really interesting. There's a part where Sowell talks about how the different visions treat or understand knowledge. And it was interesting how there was the constrained vision, how they treat knowledge or they understand knowledge as being something that is kind of passed down. It's more of what I would consider kind of wisdom in a way. It's kind of collective, it's tested by other people, and it's something that we kind of preserve and pass down. And it's whereas it's interesting, whereas the unconstrained vision has kind of a different understanding of knowledge, whereas they would say it's more reason, it's more human and individual. And and at times, in the past, the unconstrained would say we need to throw off kind of our limitations from the past, and we should let go of these traditions and what we've been held down to, and we need to just work with our brains and us as humans right now, and that's what's going to lead us to progression. And so I think it's interesting, you can see just in the definition of knowledge alone, like they're talking about very different things and they're wanting different things. But I think you can see, like, in a lot of our arguments today, or a lot of the conflict that we see today, we see a lot of conflict about like education, about justice, about legal systems, and how these things are more than just, we believe there should be more or less freedom. It's about what even is freedom and what even is the goal, which I think is so interesting.
Yeah, I love that. That reminds me of just kind of connecting the idea of like social knowledge, or like collective knowledge, versus maybe like concentrated knowledge, or even like this higher form of knowledge that the collective doesn't really have. That really reminds me of Plato's Republic. I feel like that's kind of what he's going for, like this unconstrained view. He has this perfect republic and the perfect leader, this philosopher king that knows what's best for the group, is better, like more benevolent, more wise, more learned. He's the philosopher, and Plato believes the philosopher knows the truth, and capital T truth, everything that you need to know as a human being. And that's kind of what it reminds me of, is this kind of social planning, or like social engineering, where really there's this top-down knowledge, where it's this capital R reason, that kind of is what the masses should be following. And that education, that kind of training is what's going to make that happen. And on the other side, I see kind of this experiential knowledge that you're mentioning, kind of like, it's Adam Smith, right? The invisible hand. Yes. That's kind of like everything's working because it works. Like no one started this process or like had to plan it out. Like it works because it worked. Maybe a couple people failed in the process, but now it's great and it's working, and people are doing what they know works economically, culturally, socially, and it's just kind of a natural growth of knowledge.
Yeah. That reminds me of Russell Kirk. What he writes about common law, where the idea that like law comes from the bottom up, which is kind of an interesting idea, instead of like the top down, where people are just naturally like, no, we should wear seatbelts, and it just becomes a law because everyone's like, yeah, if you're not going to wear a seatbelt, we don't like you, kind of idea, instead of like, you have to do this. We mentioned earlier that like the French Revolution versus the American Revolution is kind of representative of unconstrained versus constrained, but the more I thought, like I just thought of this now, I actually think the American Revolution, particularly the Constitutional Convention, was kind of like both visions. It's kind of where you see that conflict really well.
No, Thomas Sowell brings this up a little bit in his book, where he talks about Federalists, I think, in particular, how the Federalists in the American Revolution, they were very constrained in the sense of they're saying the government and they're pushing for the Bill of Rights because they're saying the government, is, because of human nature and because of the way things are, we need to be protected. And he points out how it's more of a constrained vision with the Federalists.
Yeah, because you might think that like fixing people with laws, or maybe it's like not trusting people with anything but laws.
But maybe that's when it comes to the idea of like, you can't be 100% one way or the other. Because I think of libertarians. Libertarians to me have this like extreme conflict of visions in my mind. Like maybe I'm a libertarian in certain ways, but it seems like they're constrained when it comes to government, where they say all men abuse power. When people get in power, it's no good. Who's that one guy that was like the huge anarchist libertarian? Like, the Anatomy of the State, whoever wrote that.
Rothbard.
Rothbard, yeah. Well, I think of Rothbard, where he's like, the state is the worst. It's awful. But then they expect people, normal everyday people, citizens, to be benevolent and to trade and to be easy go. I'm like, no, people like human nature. That's like an inconsistency in human nature for me, where it's like, oh, you think people in power will be awful and evil, but people just in their normal lives will be benevolent. That's the conflict for me, where I'm like, that's a little too contradictory for me, where the visions clash too much for me, where I'm like, no, I'd like to be more even, like more leaning one way or the other, instead of, I don't know, that's a little contradictory for me, but maybe that's why the Federalists are kind of confusing, because it does make sense. John Adams, that's my favorite Federalist. I love John Adams, but he's a huge traditionalist guy, where he's like, history is important. We have to be educated. Like tradition is really important. So it does make sense that he would be more constrained in that way. But
It's interesting. You talking about the American Revolution made me think of this. Whereas how does a certain view approach a system that's gone wrong? And I think that was something that's really interesting that they talk about, that Thomas Sowell talks about in this book, is, the constrained vision would say, there is no perfect system, that we're going to, use trade-offs, and we're going to say, there's this aspect, nothing is perfect, that there's going to be some negative aspects or repercussions from this thing, but it will give us, something better in the long term. And it kind of expects systems to fail at one point, just because we are, because of our flawed human nature. Whereas the unconstrained, they kind of have a crisis sometimes when a system fails. They're like, what happened? They don't expect or systems to fail the same way a constrained someone with a constrained vision does. And so they're looking for, what was the problem? What is the perfect system? And how do we make it perfect? Whereas the constrained is saying there's, every system, no matter how perfect we make it, is going to fail at some point. And we just need to, work through that and, try and come up with something that isn't perfect, but will at least, be beneficial in some areas.
I like that. I think that brings up something Sowell also brings up as a kind of difference between the two visions, is what kind of they expect the status quo to be. Where unconstrained, peace is the status quo. And the war and the poverty, those are weird. So we're going to study those. We're going to figure out what's wrong with those. We're going to fix those because those aren't normal. And that's what we're trying to change. Where in the constrained view, war is the norm. And times of peace or economic wealth or good, like just overall health of society, that's weird. So we're going to look at that. We're going to study. We're going to figure out how that happens. So I think even just that focus of what is the anomaly in life is a difference that he points out.
Yeah. What you mentioned, Meg, that's one of my favorite differences he talks about with the constrained and unconstrained, is the constrained believes in trade-offs, whereas the unconstrained believes in perfect solutions. So he makes it sound like one will have a lot harder time compromising on things.
Which one?
Perfect solutions, for sure. But it reminded me, this came up in the news a couple weeks ago, where Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader, he forfeited on the bill to pass the budget. And all the Democrats were like, how dare you? How dare you do this to us? But it just makes me think, a lot of other bills too, where Republicans will vote on this bill and then the Democrats will dig up a bunch of dirt, this bill did all this awful things, even though the Republican probably voted for it because of the other good things it did, you know what I'm saying? So that's an interesting concept in politics to me, where it's how much do you trade off? Because I don't believe in perfect solutions. I am definitely constrained in that way, where I don't think that's real. But back to the Constitutional Convention, I think a lot of people would say they shouldn't have compromised on slavery. They should have outlawed slavery immediately, and that shouldn't have been a trade-off. Even though it totally was. They had to trade off with the South in order to get them to ratify the Constitution, but, you can't have perfect solutions. I think that makes a lot of people so uncomfortable, where, you have to deal with icky stuff for a while until you can, come to a trade-off.
That is hard, though. Where do you think the line is, though, between trade-off and compromise? Because, compromise to me, trade-off seems a lot more neutral, but, compromise is, compromising integrity or morality or things with the slavery thing, which is a great example. Yeah. So where do you think that line is? Should we be okay with a lesser of two evils in office? Kind of something perhaps on some people's minds this year or last year. But yeah, what do you guys think? Where is that line?
Well, I think it's interesting how when we're talking about, trade-offs and compromising, to realize these, we've been talking about, these visions are the extreme and it's on a spectrum. And it makes me think of, the golden mean, and saying, is the center of these two where we want to be? Right. And is, or is it, is there another area that we need to be? But I do think it's interesting of, is it through trade-offs or through compromising, I guess. In my mind, kind of more compromising, but is it that we are able to slowly work our way into this golden mean, this balance in the middle.
That's really interesting. And it would be it would be really nice if political parties were actually just visions, because I don't think they are. Because when you say compromise, it's like, oh, let's compromise between the two political parties, which would maybe be ideal as well. But I definitely think a compromise between the two visions would be better, because like I think both visions really do offer valuable things to the world.
Yeah.
I agree. Like compromise and trade-offs there I see as really valuable and kind of like the golden mean. But then when it's things like, maybe it's once you get into things like policy and like things that aren't necessarily based, like it's not so simple as left versus right. It's not so simple as unconstrained or constrained. Sometimes the issue is between constrained or really constrained. And so then it's well...
Yeah. One thing I love about Thomas Sowell in this book is, we each have, our visions, and we've been able to kind of acknowledge them and come to realize this more from reading this book. But in this book, Thomas Sowell is not taking a side. He's not saying one vision is better than the other in this book. He's simply like stating the fact and letting us see these. And I think this is something really interesting about it, is that our visions are something that are often hidden to us. It's something we don't easily recognize or see. And it's something, it's different than a paradigm, which I think is interesting. It's not something we've thought through intellectually or we've, come up with. It's something he kind of talks about being more innate, kind of something that we just aren't even thinking about. It's kind of something subconscious. He describes it as a pre-analytic cognitive act, something we haven't thought about yet. And therefore it's something we're acting on and using like a paradigm all the time, but yet we haven't thought about and we haven't addressed it. And I think that's something really interesting. Is it's easy to say, to compare these to like, right and left or politics or other things, but it's something bigger than just, our views on politics or something. It's something, the way we view the world, and even it's something more than a paradigm. It's something we don't even quite recognize all the time that we have, which I think is something fascinating.
It's fascinating. It also kind of sounds like a scam. Like I think it could feel like you just don't know. You know these things and think these things, but you don't know why.
Things that you need to know that you didn't know.
You didn't know, and you can't tell. But I just think Mr. C asked me a question a few days ago. Like, do you think people connect their how did he put it? But like, do you think people use logic for their to get to their opinions? And obviously not, because there are a lot of opinions out there that are really illogical from a lot of different perspectives. There are things that we don't understand about ourselves, and I think that's valuable to recognize. Is like, that's one step. It's like, I don't know this about myself, and exploring this, at least for me, it was really a good way for me to kind of get to know myself a little bit more. It's like, this is kind of the unconscious bias that I do live with, and this is kind of exposing a little bit of that and understanding that. Might not get rid of the bias, but now I know it's there, and so now I can kind of just acknowledge it and recognize the weaknesses that come with that.
Yeah, one thing I really like, I think it's at the beginning of his book, which he talks about, is kind of like why we even have them in the first place. And I think it's really interesting. He talks about kind of the role a vision plays in our lives. And I love this part. I'm going to read it. He says, visions fill in the necessary large gaps in individual knowledge. Thus, for an example, an individual may act in one way in some area in which he has great knowledge, but in just the opposite way elsewhere, where he is relying on a vision he has never tested empirically. And I think that's something that's really interesting, is these visions are playing a role. We don't understand fully, a situation or what's happening. And so our vision is there helping us kind of fill in the pieces and guiding us. He once uses the term a map in this, as it's kind of this map kind of helping us navigate how we make decisions, how are we going to act in ways that we don't know everything. And so it's interesting to see how they are valuable in some ways. They help us fill in those gaps. But I think it's interesting that he points out our knowledge in an area affects the influence our vision has. Because like we've been talking about, a vision is not this, logical process we've thought through and we've, completely identified. It's something much more subconscious that just we fill in and that we have innately. And so that's one thing I learned from this book is that, while this is, while my vision is there and in some ways it's helpful, the more knowledge I gain, the more experience, the more I can see, a situation, that the less I'm going to have to rely on my vision and the less it's going to kind of taint or skew my view of things.
I had a similar experience reading this book where a little bit less of like, oh, I'm biased, because I knew I was biased before, but kind of more clarity about how I was, because I really don't like hypocrisy. I think it's like one of the worst evils in the world. It's kind of a weird thing to hate, but I don't like it, and I think it's everywhere. And especially studying history at Mount Liberty, like you just see it in historical figures, like just over and over again. You see this cycle of history repeat itself, where people just tend to be really hypocritical. But that quote that I read, where like no one has 100% one vision or the other. So in politics, or even like discussing with people or approaching different people with different visions, it's like such a reminder to me that we, like, all of us are hypocrites because all of us believe both visions. It just depends on like the percentage or the field we're talking about. And so that has been so helpful to me in reminding myself where like I approach someone that's like, no, humans are good. No, they're evil. Like, actually, I do believe humans are good. Especially all the humans I talk to every day. Like, they're wonderful people. And a lot of people choose to be really good sometimes. So that was really helpful to me in reading this book to recognize that, like, being a hypocrite's inevitable, unfortunately. Because you have to have some type of hybrid that conflicts inside of you. And also approaching people realizing, even though I think they're crazy a little bit for believing certain things, I actually believe them in other areas of my life as well. That's just a little taste of what we do here at Mount Liberty. Read books like this and discuss it. It's a lot of fun. We love it. And that's, like, each class we read books like this where we learn things about ourselves and the world that help us talk to other people and kind of decode history a lot instead of approaching it from just Instagram or TikTok.
I think for me, I've mentioned this before, but I think it just is, and Ella, you kind of mentioned it too, just being able to talk with other people and share ideas with other people. I think this book especially, because it talks about other perspectives, but all books that share ideas that I agree or disagree with, I really feel like that has contributed a lot to how I view other people's perspectives. I think it's helped me have more empathy, and even if not empathy, just understanding and willingness to talk more with someone about topics that I don't understand at all, but I understand maybe where they're coming from, or I understand why it's important to listen to ideas that I don't understand yet. And so kind of being more comfortable in being uncomfortable, I would say, is something that this book specifically has helped me a lot with.
No, and kind of going along with that, Megan, I feel like there's a lot of conflicts in the world that we see all around us. And there's a lot of things that, we can say, we can debate, there's lots of logic on both sides of saying, debating one side over another, and how it's this continual circle, kind of like Thomas Sowell talks about, of this debate that is always going on and never really getting anywhere. And I think one thing that Mount Liberty has helped me kind of see is what's the reason, get past this debate and understanding what's the reasoning behind this and the motivation behind these, because then we can actually address and kind of get somewhere and go somewhere, and not just even have sympathy for the other side or and other opinions, but start actually breaching gaps and realizing, we can actually make progress and we can actually start to come together on issues and topics, I think.
More broadly, like, this book for sure taught me this, but just kind of the humanities in general. I think a lot of people in the world lack identity and purpose and just, like, a soul. I don't know, everyone has a soul. But, like, meaning in their lives. And the humanities, to me, helped me overcome a lot of a lot of like self-hatred or self-deprecation, because when you read books like this, and understand the way people work a lot better, you understand yourself better. And I've definitely felt that as I read books about Liberty, especially this one because of what it taught me about like hypocrisy, that you are less alone in the world and you realize you're really not doing too bad. But you also find a lot of identity in all of these people that struggle the same way you struggle. And yeah, I don't know, I found a lot of identity and purpose in studying works like this because I see myself reflected back in the books.
Well, and I think that's the most valuable thing in a world where, we've got AI and we've got all these things that are adding to the world. To have identity, to have meaning, to know who you are, and to know who humanity is, I think is so valuable.